Averroès' Search. S'imaginons que la tragédie n'est autre chose que la diluée. Ernest Renan, Averroès, 48, 1861. Abu al-Walid Muhammad ibn Ahmad ibn Rushd. It would take that long name, passing through Ben Rist and Avenris, and even Aben Rasad, and even Filius Rosadis, 100 years to become. Averroès was at work on the 11th chapter of his work, Tahafut al-Tahafut, Destruction of the Destruction, which maintains, contrary to the Persian ascetic al-Ghazali, author of the Tahafut al-Falasifa, Destruction of Philosophers, that the deity knows only the general laws of the universe, those that apply not to the individual but to the species, who wrote with slow assurance from right to left. The shaping of syllogisms and linking together of vast paragraphs did not keep him from feeling like a sense of wonderful well-being, the cool, deep house around him. In the depths of the siesta, loving turtle-doves purred throatily, one to another. From some invisible courtyard came the murmur of a fountain, something in the flesh of Averroès, whose ancestors had come from the deserts of Arabia, was grateful for the steadfast presence of the water. Below lay the gardens of flowers and of foodstuffs. Below that ran the bustling Guadalquivir. Beyond the river spread the beloved city of Cordoba, as bright as Baghdad or Cairo, like a complex and delicate instrument. And encircling Cordoba, this Averroès could feel too. Extending to the very frontier, stretched the land of Spain, where there were not a great many things, yet where each thing seemed to exist, materially and eternally. His quill ran across the page, the arguments, irrefutable, knitted together, and yet a small worry clouded Averroès' happiness. Not the sort of worry brought on by the Tahafut, which was a fortuitous enterprise, but rather a philological problem, connected with the monumental work that would justify him, to all people, his commentary on Aristotle. That Greek sage, the fountainhead of all philosophy, had been sent down to men to teach them all things that can be known. Interpreting Aristotle's works in the same way the ulemas interpret the Quran was the hard task that Averroès had set himself. History will record few things lovelier and more moving than this Arab physician's devotion to the thoughts of a man separated from him by a gulf of 14 centuries. To the intrinsic difficulties of the enterprise, we might add that Averroès, who knew neither Syriac nor Greek, was working from a translation of a translation. The night before, 2 doubtful words had halted him at the very portals of the poetics. Those words were tragedy and comedy. He had come across them years earlier in the 3rd book of the Rhetoric. No one in all of Islam could hazard a guess as to their meaning. He had pored through the pages of Alexander of Aphrodisias, compared the translations of the Nestorian Hunayn ibn Ishaq and Abu Bashar Mata, and he had found nothing. Yet the 2 arcane words were everywhere in the text of the Poetics. It was impossible to avoid them. Averroès laid down his quill. He told himself without conviction that what we seek is often near at hand, put away the manuscript of the Tahafut, and went to the shelf on which the many volumes of blind Ibn Sinna's Muqam, copied by Persian copyists, stood neatly aligned. Of course, he had already consulted them, but he was tempted by the idle pleasure of turning their pages. He was distracted from that scholarly distraction by a kind of song. He looked out through the bars of the balcony. There below, in the narrow earthen courtyard, half-naked children were at play. One of them, standing on the shoulders of another, was clearly playing at being a muezzin. His eyes tightly closed, he was chanting the muezzin's monotonous cry, "There is no God but Allah." The boy, standing motionless and holding him on his shoulders, was the turret from which he sang. Another, kneeling, bowing low in the dirt, was the congregation of the faithful. The game did not last long. They all wanted to be the muezzin, and no one wanted to be the worshippers or the minaret. Averroès listened to them arguing in the vulgar dialect, that is, the incipient Spanish, of the Muslim masses of the peninsula. He opened Khalil's Kitab el-Ain and thought proudly that in all of Cordoba, perhaps in all of Al-Andalus, there was no other copy of the perfect work. Only this one, sent him by Emir Yaqub al-Mansur from Tangier. The name of that port reminded him that the traveller Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari, who had returned from Morocco, was to dine with him that evening at the home of the Quranist Faraj. Abu al-Hasan claimed to have reached the kingdoms of the Sin Empire, China, with that peculiar logic born of hatred. His detractors swore that he had never set foot in China, and that he had blasphemed Allah in the temples of that land. The gathering would inevitably last for hours. Averroës hurriedly went back to his work on the Tahafut. He worked until dusk. At Faraj's house, the conversation moved from the incomparable virtues of the governor to those of his brother, the emir. Then, out in the garden, the talk was of roses. Abu al-Hasan, having never seen them, said there were no roses like those which bedeck the villas of Andalusia. Faraj was not to be suborned by flattery. He observed that the learned Ibn Qutaybah had described a superb variety of perpetual rose which grows in the gardens of Hindustan, and whose petals, of a deep red crimson, exhibit characters reading, "There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet." He added that Abu al-Hasan must surely be acquainted with those roses. Abu al-Hasan looked at him in alarm. If he said yes, he would be judged by all, quite rightly, to be the most pliable and serviceable of impostors. If he said no, he would be judged an infidel. He opted to breathe that Allah held the keys that unlock hidden things, and that there was no green or wilted thing on earth that was not recorded in his book. Those words belong to one of the first surahs of the Quran. They were received with a reverential murmur. Puffed up by that victory of dialectics, Abu al-Hasan was about to declare that Allah is perfect in his works and inscrutable. But Averroës, prefiguring the distant arguments of a still problematic Hume, interrupted. "I find it less difficult to accept an error in the learned Ibn Qutaybah or in the copyists," he said, "than to accept that the earth brings forth roses with the profession of our faith." "Precisely. Great words and true," said Abu al-Hasan. "Some traveller, I recall," mused the poet Abd al-Malik, "speaks of a tree whose branches put forth green birds. I am pained less by believing in that tree than in roses adorned with letters." "The bird's colour," said Averroës, "does seem to make that wonder easier to bear. In addition, both birds and the fruit of trees belong to the natural world, while writing is an art. To move from leaves to birds is easier than to move from roses to letters." Another guest indignantly denied that writing was an art. Since the original book of the Quran, the mother of the book, predates the creation and resides in heaven. Another spoke of Al-Janiz of Basra, who had stated that the Quran is a substance that can take the form of man or animal, an opinion which appears to agree with that of the people who attribute to the Quran two faces. Faraj discoursed long on orthodox doctrine. "The Quran," he said, "is one of the attributes of Allah, even as His mercy is. It may be copied in a book, pronounced with the tongue, or remembered in the heart, but while language and signs and writing are the work of men, the Quran itself is irrevocable and eternal." Averroës, who had written his commentary on the Republic, might have said that the mother of the book is similar, in a way, to the Platonic idea, but he could see that theology was one subject utterly beyond the grasp of Abu al-Hasan. Others, who had come to the same realization, urged Abu al-Hasan to tell a tale of wonder. Then, like now, the world was horrible. Daring men might wander through it, but so might wretches, those who fall down in the dust before all things. Abu al-Hasan's memory was a mirror of secret acts of cowardice. What story could he tell? Besides, the guests demanded marvels, while the marvelous was, perhaps, incommunicable. The moon of Bengal is not the same as the moon of Yemen, but it deigns to be described with the same words. Abu al-Hasan pondered. Then he spoke. He who wanders through climes and cities, his unctuous voice began, sees many things worthy of belief. This, for instance, which I have told but once before to the king of the Turks. It took place in Sinni Katal canton, where the river of the water of life spills into the sea. Faraj asked whether the city lay many leagues from that wall erected by Iskandar Dhu al-Qawarnayn, Alexander of Macedonia, to halt the advance of Gog and Magog. There are vast deserts between them, Abu al-Hasan said, with inadvertent haughtiness. 40 days must a kafila caravan travel before catching sight of its towers, and another 40, men say, before the kafila stands before them. In Sini Kalal, I know of no man who has seen it, or seen the man who has seen it. For one moment, the fear of the grossly infinite, of mere space, mere matter, laid its hand on Averroës. He looked at the symmetrical garden. He realized that he was old, useless, unreal. Then Abu al-Hasan spoke again. One evening, the Muslim merchants of Sini Kalal conducted me to a house of painted wood in which many persons lived. It is not possible to describe that house, which was more like a single room, with rows of cabinet-like contrivances, or balconies, one atop another. In these niches, there were people eating and drinking. There were people sitting on the floor as well, and also on a raised terrace. The people on this terrace were playing the tambour and the lute, all, that is, save some 15 or 20, who wore crimson masks and prayed and sang and conversed among themselves. These masked ones suffered imprisonment. But no one could see the jail. They rode upon horses, but the horse was not to be seen. They waged battle, but the swords were of bamboo. They died, and then they walked again. The acts of madmen, said Faraj, are beyond that which a sane man can envision. They were not madmen, Abu al-Hasan had to explain. They were, a merchant told me, presenting a story. No one understood, no one seemed to want to understand. Abu al-Hasan, in some confusion, swerved from the tale he had been telling them into inept explanation. Aiding himself with his hands, he said, "Let us imagine that someone shows a story instead of telling it, the story of the 7 sleepers of Ephesus, say. We see them retire into the cavern, we see them pray and sleep, we see them sleep with their eyes open, we see them grow while they are asleep, we see them awaken after 309 years, we see them hand the merchant an ancient coin, we see them awaken in paradise, we see them awaken with the dog." It was something like that the persons on the terrace showed us that evening. "Did these persons speak?" asked Faraj. "Of course they did," said Abu al-Hasan, now become the apologist for a performance that he only barely recalled, and that had irritated him considerably at the time. "They spoke and sang and gave long, boring speeches." "In that case," said Faraj, "there was no need for 20 persons. A single speaker could tell anything, no matter how complex it might be." To that verdict, they all gave their nod. They extolled the virtues of Arabic, the language used by Allah, they recalled, when he instructs the angels, and then the poetry of the Arabs. After according that poetry its due praise, Abu al-Hasan dismissed those other poets, who, writing in Cordoba or Damascus, clung to pastoral images and Bedouin vocabulary, outmoded. He called them. He said it was absurd for a man whose eyes beheld the wide Guadalquivir to compose odes upon the water of a well. It was time, he argued, that the old metaphors be renewed. Back when Zuhair compared fate to a blind camel, he said, the figure was arresting, but 500 years of admiration had worn it very thin. To that verdict, which they had all heard many times before, from many mouths, they all likewise gave their nod. Averroës, however, kept silent. At last he spoke, not so much to the others as to himself. Less eloquently, he said, and yet with similar arguments, I myself have sometimes defended the proposition argued now by Abu al-Hasan. In Alexandria, there is a saying that only the man who has already committed a crime and repented of it is incapable of that crime. To be free of an erroneous opinion, I myself might add, one must at some time have professed it. In his Mu'allaqah, Zuhair says that in the course of his 80 years of pain and glory, many is the time he has seen destiny trample men like an old blind camel. Abu al-Hasan says that that figure no longer makes us marvel. One might reply to that objection in many ways. First, that if the purpose of the poem were to astound, its life would not be measured in centuries, but in days, or hours, or perhaps even minutes. Second, that a famous poet is less an inventor than a discoverer. In praise of Ibn Sharaf of Berkha, it has many times been said that only he was capable of imagining that the stars of the morning sky fall gently, like leaves falling from the trees. If that were true, it would prove only that the image is trivial. The image that only a single man can shape is an image that interests no man. There are infinite things upon the earth. Any one of them can be compared to any other. Comparing stars to leaves is no less arbitrary than comparing them to fish or birds. On the other hand, every man has surely felt, at some moment in his life, that destiny is powerful, yet clumsy, innocent, yet inhuman. In order to record that feeling, which may be fleeting or constant, but which no man may escape experiencing, that Zuhair's line was written. No one will ever say better what Zuhair said there. Furthermore, and this is perhaps the essential point of my reflections, time, which ravages fortresses and great cities, only enriches poetry. At the time it was composed by him in Arabia, Zuhair's poetry served to bring together two images, that of the old camel and that of destiny. Repeated today, it serves to recall Zuhair and to conflate our own tribulations with those of that dead Arab. The figure had two terms. Today it has four. Time widens the circle of the verses, and I myself know some verses that are, like music, all things to all men. Thus it was that many years ago, in Marrakesh, tortured by memories of Cordoba, I soothed myself by repeating the apostrophe which Abd al-Rahman spoke in the gardens of al-Rusaifa to an African palm. Thou too art, O palm, on this foreign soil. A remarkable gift. The gift bestowed by poetry, words written by a king homesick for the Orient, served to comfort me when I was far away in Africa, homesick for Spain. Then Averroës spoke of the first poets, those who, in the time of ignorance, before Islam, had already said all things in the infinite language of the deserts. Alarmed, and not without reason, by the insane versifications of Ibn Sharaf, he said that in the ancients and the Quran could all poetry be read, and he condemned as illiterate and vain all desire to innovate. The others listened with pleasure, for he was vindicating that which was old. Muezzins were calling the faithful to the prayer of first light when Averroës entered his library again. In the harem, the black-haired slave girls had tortured a red-haired slave girl, but Averroës was not to know that until evening. Something had revealed to him the meaning of the two obscure words. With firm, painstaking calligraphy, he added these lines to the manuscript. Aristotle gives the name tragedy to panegyrics, and the name comedy to satires and anathemas. There are many admirable tragedies and comedies in the Quran and the mulaqat of the mosque. He felt sleep coming upon him. He felt a chill. His turban unwound, he looked at himself in a metal mirror. I do not know what his eyes beheld, for no historian has described the forms of his face. I know that he suddenly disappeared, as though annihilated by a fire without light, and that with him disappeared the house, and the unseen fountain, and the books, and the manuscripts, and the turtle doves, and the many black-haired slave girls, and the trembling red-haired slave girl, and Faraj, and Abu al-Hassan, and the rose bushes, and perhaps even the Guadalquivir. In the preceding tale, I have tried to narrate the process of failure, the process of defeat. I thought first of that Archbishop of Canterbury who set himself the task of proving that God exists. Then I thought of the alchemists who sought the philosopher's stone. Then of the vain trisectors of the angle and squares of the circle. Then I reflected that a more poetic case than these would be a man who sets himself a goal that is not forbidden to other men, but is forbidden to him. I recalled Averroës, who, bounded within the circle of Islam, could never know the meaning of the words tragedy and comedy. I told his story. As I went on, I felt what that God mentioned by Burton must have felt. The God who set himself the task of creating a bull, but turned out a buffalo. I felt that the work mocked me, foiled me, thwarted me. I felt that Averroës, trying to imagine what a play is, without ever having suspected what a theatre is, was no more absurd than I, trying to imagine Averroës, yet with no more material than a few snatches from Renan, Lane, and Asin Palacios. I felt, on the last page, that my story was a symbol of the man I had been as I was writing it, and that, in order to write that story, I had to be that man, and that, in order to be that man, I had to write that story, and so on, ad infinitum. And just when I stop believing in him, Averroës disappears.